Welcome to Applied Photophysics Higher Order Structure video series. In this video, we're going to explore two case studies in quantitative circular dichroism higher order structure analysis as representative examples to show the power of the technique. In the first case study, a primary standard of NISTmAb is compared to its reference standard. The second case study illustrates the effect of forced degradation stress conditions on the higher order structure of monoclonal antibodies. Subsequent videos in this series survey practical considerations for conducting higher order structure comparison experiments, as well as guidelines for processing the resulting data. Also, if you haven't already, check out our first video in the HOS series with a behind-the-scenes look at the math underpinning HOS comparisons. The characterization of biotherapeutics in general, and monoclonal antibody therapeutics, or MABs in particular, is a complex task involving many biophysical techniques. NISTmAb is an excellent case study on the matter. NISTmAb is a humanized monoclonal antibody developed by the National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST, that is available to biopharmaceutical companies as a representative test molecule to assist in method development and qualification and in evaluating and comparing instrument performance and analytical techniques. Applied Photophysics directly contributed to the NISTmAb project by comparing a primary standard of NISTmAb, PS 8670, with the reference material, RM 8671, via analysis of 6 independent replicates for each standard using our Chiroscan Q100 automated CD spectrometer. As can be expected, the far UV spectrum is characteristic of a protein with a high beta sheet content, with a distinct peak at 202 nanometers and a negative peak at 218 nanometers. However, the far UV spectra contain information beyond secondary structure elements. As highlighted in the inset plot, signals of lower amplitude around and above 230 nanometers arise from disulfide bonds and are expected to be sensitive to the dihedral angles of these bonds. The profile of the near UV spectra is much more complex, as it is composed of overlapping contributions by the aromatic amino acid side chains of 24-tryptophan, 52-tyrosine, and 50-phenylalanine residues, as well as 16 disulfide linkages. The near UV CD contributions by these aromatic residues depend on their type, number, orientation, and environment. CD spectra were normalized to absorbance at 192 nanometers in the far UV and 280 nanometers in the near UV to account for any slight differences between replicate spectra that actually result from differences in concentration rather than from structural differences. The spectra were then overlaid, and the structural differences were evaluated by means of weighted spectral difference, or WSD. Although the near UV spectra appear to be superimposable by visual inspection, statistical analysis via WSD reveals that the tertiary structure of RM8671 is significantly different to that of PS8670. Well, this is not the case for the secondary structure. Such small spectral differences in the near UV can only be found with state-of-the-art CD instruments that provide the required sensitivity and reproducibility for robust statistical analysis. Another application of HOS analysis is forced degradation studies of monoclonal antibodies. The rationale underlying forced degradation studies is to accelerate product degradation and thus mimic real-world storage conditions in a much shorter time frame. The data resulting from these studies informs on stability, storage conditions, and expected shelf life of the biotherapeutic. For the HOS comparisons, antibody-based samples were subjected to different stress conditions, including high pH and elevated temperature to promote asparagine deamidation and aspartic acid isomerization, as well as conditions promoting oxidation and glycation. For each condition, 5 independent replicates were assessed by near UV CD using a Chiroscan Q100. Spectra were again normalized to absorbance at 280 nanometers. The near UV spectra of all samples have a similar fingerprint profile with contributions from aromatic amino acids and disulfide bonds. While the difference between the oxidation spectrum and the reference spectrum is fairly obvious from visual inspection, it is less clear for the other stress conditions. In particular, the glycation spectrum looks as similar to the reference as the control spectrum does to the reference. However, minor alterations in tertiary structure can result, for example, from changes in the dihedral angles of disulfide bonds that are so subtle that they elude visual inspection. In this example, we will again use the weighted spectral difference method for a comparative analysis to assess the similarity of any two spectra. WSD values were first calculated between reference replicates, i.e. reference-reference comparisons, followed by the reference versus individual sample replicates, i.e. reference-sample comparisons, and then all values were plotted together. All stress conditions resulted in statistically significant changes in tertiary structure. Even the glycation conditions, which resulted in spectra highly similar to the reference and visually indistinguishable from the control, led to a statistically significant change in tertiary structure. The very minor spectral changes resulting from exposure to these stress conditions most likely would have been overlooked by visual inspection. The detection and statistical comparison are only possible by utilizing the exceptional sensitivity and reproducibility of instruments like the Chiroscan Q100. To conclude, we'll briefly contrast classical CD analyses with the advanced capabilities of modern CD spectrometers for HOS comparisons. Traditional comparative CD analysis relies on qualitative visual inspection of overlaid spectra, prone to subjective user error. Moreover, CD data are typically subjected to the absolute analysis of secondary structure decomposition, providing percentages for relative secondary structure composition, a valid and common practice even today. However, this classical analysis is highly dependent on accurate user input and user choices such as the selection of a CD data reference set, and as such, yields results that are affected by additional factors of uncertainty and should be considered as estimates. In contrast, modern HOS analysis with the highly sensitive Chiroscan Q100 extends beyond alpha helix and beta sheet to include quantitative and internally referenced comparisons across both far and near UV regions. The Q100's streamlined autosampling and data analysis discussed throughout our HOS video series significantly enhance experimental reproducibility, comparability, and reliability. We hope this second video in our higher order structure video series has been of value to you. Be sure to like and subscribe to our channel to be notified when new videos are released. For more information, including application notes, hardware and software support, and contact information, visit photophysics.com.